with Joe McClane and EmilyiAlcaraz.
And I think we're good now. So jumping on the air with us right now is Dr. Alan Keyes. He is a former ambassador to the United Nations under President Ronald Reagan, three-time candidate for the President of the United States. Good morning to you, Dr. Keyes.
Good morning. How are you?
Praise God, I'm alive. It's good to have you on the program. We're very grateful to you for being on with us. I wanted to jump in with you. Our country is deeply divided, Dr. Keyes. And it seems like there's a great, the lust for power and control is growing and growing more and more these days. How do you look at our current situation in our country?
Well, I think we're in the midst of the greatest existential crisis that the United States has ever faced, unless you want to include the revolutionary period, when, of course, the existence of the country was in the balance, but it hadn't come into being yet. Aside from that, I think that this crisis is worse, in fact, than the Civil War, because it reflects a fundamental divide. Lincoln was able to say, I think with some truth, in his famous address, that both sides prayed to the same God, right? Well, I don't think that's true anymore. I think the sense that there's a fundamental premise of authority that this country looks to has been abandoned by people who have adopted ideologies that deny God, deny, therefore, the premise of God-endowed, unalienable rights. Yes?
Talking about the divided nature of our country. Dr. Keyes, I hated to interrupt you, but we had a hard break there. Thank you for being on our program again. 2020.
Very familiar.
2020 was a year of some surprises, and yet it was a year that could have been predicted in some ways too. And I was watching a talk you gave, I think, to it was 2019. I forget the group, but it was a powerful talk you gave where you talked about how the far left uses pandemics, epidemics to try to consolidate and take power and to control the thinking of people based on labels and identities and the cross section of gender ideology and the rest. How do we as Catholics respond to all of that?
Well, I was going to say, I think we respond, at least in the American context, by remembering what is the ground and foundation of our country. It's not that often in history that, as an essential matter, a country, a nation, a people comes into existence on the basis of an idea where God is the center of it all, so that the country, the government, the politics, everything requires that you remember God's authority. But America is that way, because the basic premise for our self-government, so the form of government that has us going to the polls and voting for representatives rather than being subject to people because they have power, right? The ordinary forms of government throughout human history have been forms of government that grew out of the power of certain people, usually in some military form because they beat you on the battlefield or were otherwise able to overcome you through terrorizing you and otherwise using their power. Or there could be people who had amassed wealth and controlled you because they were the only source of jobs and income that let you support your family and things of this kind. There was always that elitist quality. America was founded on the premise that every human being has rights that come from God and that governments aren't based on the results of war. They are based on observing what is right according to the endowment of God's will and coming together as human beings dedicated to doing right in those terms and establishing governments to reflect that dedication. So throughout the history of the country, there's been a battle going on between people who essentially represent the old way of doing things, where power is all that matters, and you do what you're told by those in power, and people who believe that God is in charge, and that under God's rule, human beings are entitled to a certain respect if they are walking the path that accords with God's will. And I think our whole way of life depends on that. We have been gradually coming under the influence of people who reject it, who reject God, first of all, and then reject everything that is the consequence of God's will, like respect for innocent human life. And so we get involved in things that have overturned the founding premises of the country, but without telling people that that's what they were doing. You see what I'm saying? No. They would have the Declaration occasionally in their mouths, and they would talk about rights and justice. And meanwhile, they follow ideologies where there is no right but what is determined by the outcomes of power. And once you get that power in your hands, it is absolute, and you use it according to your will in order to dictate to others, even if what you dictate is contrary to God's will. And that's the situation we're in. And the question is, as a people, are we going to accept that now as the basis for the society we live in, because it removes us from the position of being members of the sovereign body of the people on account of our reverence for God's authority, and puts us in the position of being serfs and slaves of whoever happens to have the power of government in their hands.
We're talking with Dr. Alan Keyes, former ambassador to the UN under Ronald Reagan. Now, Dr. Keyes, you had a major role to play in the Mexico City policy. And I would like for you to explain maybe to our audience what the Mexico City policy is and why it should be shocking to us as Catholics in particular that it gets reversed under the second Catholic president in our nation's history. Dr. Keyes.
Well, the Mexico City policy is called that because it's a policy that was forged by the Reagan administration in preparation for the Mexico City Population Conference in 1984, I think it was. And I attended as one of the three representatives to the conference. The lead representative was James Buckley, and I was one of the two others. And I was charged with the task, in fact, of implementing this policy, that is, of working with other nations in order to establish that other nations also supported what we were doing, which of course they did. Nations in Latin and South America, Africa, the Middle East, they were under all kinds of pressure to accept abortion, to have it forced on them as a part of health care, and they were refusing to do so on grounds of moral principle, that they respected the right and dignity of the child in the womb. So I actually found that, contrary to what the press had said about our policy, we didn't have a hard time putting together a coalition that essentially backed us up, because it was the view that was on the heart of most of the countries that were at the conference, and we got their support eventually, much to the chagrin, I think, of the media at the time and others who backed the abortion stance. But we're now in a position where, the alleged president, Joe Biden, I call him alleged for various reasons, because that's the word you use when something is claimed on the basis of doubtful evidence. And there's a controversy about the evidence, so I use that word from the law. Anyway, he comes in, and his first action, practically, is to abrogate, President Trump's restoration of the Mexico City policy, so that we would no longer be funding abortion. Now, why is that important? Because if you fund these international organizations with U.S. money, you empower them, and they pressure countries to adopt abortion as part of healthcare and force it on all healthcare providers in their country. So we essentially become the champions of the spread of this evil. And I think it's appalling that someone who calls himself a Catholic and says he's a devout Catholic would then stand away from God's will as inerrantly pronounced by the Church's teaching for the whole time that it has been in existence. That we would then put the country in the position again of basically funding this kind of pressure against good. You see what I'm saying? And that suggests what I was started out to say. We're dealing now with a major divide. A country that was founded on the premise that we all agree on doing right according to God's will, because that's what the endowment of unalienable right meant to the people who said it, meant to the people who wrote the Constitution, meant throughout our history, so that it became a basis for opposing and overturning slavery, Jim Crow, segregation, unequal rights for women. You see what I'm saying? The whole premise that we fought for as a nation was that we had to become a people worthy of the standard laid down, when we were founded. And now you have a large number of people who are ideological. They call it ideological. They all pretend to be for rights for the downtrodden, rights for black people, and rights for minority, and so forth and so on. And then they follow a kind of racism that is the worst possible racism, anti-human racism. They're not going to kill you because you're black. They're not going to kill you because you're Asian. They're not going to kill you because you're part of this minority or that, or speak this language or that, or come from this country or that. They're going to kill you because you're an innocent human being who can't defend him or herself. And they're going to call that justice.
Now, Dr. Alan Keyes.
Yeah.
Sorry, excuse me. So we're getting a comment from YouTube. Michael had a question for you. He wants to know if you can address Washington's farewell address from 1796, where he says, quote, "And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion." So it seems like our founding fathers believed that we needed religion in order to remain a moral society. Do you think this idea still exists today?
3 minutes left in the program.
Well, see, I think the greatest mistake that we ever accepted as a people was the notion that separation of church and state, meaning banish God from your country, banish religion, banish faith. It's not possible. We are a nation premised on the notion that the people get to govern themselves through representatives in a legislature and through people then that they elect to carry out the laws. Why? Because of God-endowed unalienable rights. What are those? Rights that are inherent in our nature, programmed, as it were, into the warp and woof of our spirit as well as our bodies. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
By God, by the Creator. By the way, the one who is identified in the Scripture as the Word made flesh, who dwelt amongst us, who was with God and was God, as the one through whom all things were made. So when they invoked the Creator, they were standing on the premises, on biblical premises. I often tell people, the Bible, the Declaration of Independence is the bridge between the Bible and the Constitution. And if we stand away from the Declaration, stand away from God's authority, our country will collapse? No. Our country is collapsing. In case people haven't noticed, we're disintegrating. We're standing on the verge of an abyss that will either plunge us into war or see us torn away from everything that makes us a free people, free in the sense that we participate in the decisions of government. We choose those who are to carry them out. We are not simply the subjects of rulers who can have us do according to their will no matter what God says. That's where we are right now. So yeah, I think that we are coming to the existential crisis that started when we started to back away from the premise of God's authority on which the country was founded and which led, I believe, to all of its success. Insofar as we've been a successful country, it was on account of the strength, the courage, the faith, and the moral rectitude that guided choice at critical times when justice was at stake.
Mm-hmm.
We've been talking with Dr. Alan Keyes, former ambassador to the UN under Ronald Reagan. Thank you, Dr. Keyes, for your time this morning. We're sorry about the internet connection at the beginning of our conversation, but it was a great conversation for as short as it was. We're very grateful, and we'd love to have you back sometime.
I'd love to be back.
All right. God love you. God bless you, Dr. Keyes. Have a great day. That's going to do it for the first hour of our show. We're so grateful to all of you who joined us in this program. If you can join us in the next hour, we got more Catholic Drive Time on the way, the game show. We have the Saint of the Day, Gospel of the Day, plus more breaking news and stories. All of that, you can live stream us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Join us. We'd love to have you. God bless you. God love you. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining us on Your Catholic Drive Time, where it is our pleasure to keep you informed and inspired.
Join us Monday through Friday at the same time, right here on your favorite Catholic radio station.
Don't forget to connect with us. Just go to facebook.com/Catholic Drive Time.
Again, that's facebook.com/Catholic Drive Time.
Be sure to share more than just us today. Share Jesus with everyone you meet.
Bye now, and God love you.